Information about Rick Wolf's podcast at our website. Nation magazine reporter John Nichols has written a whole book about socialism in the USA, The S Word. It has a long and storied American history, in fact, he says. Last summer, I had a chance to ask John about his book and more. For more information about The S Word, you can go to our website.
I'm John Nichols. I write about politics for the Nation magazine, but one of the things I'm most interested in is social movements and political movements. And one of the things that always strikes me is that we have a very poor sense of history as regards our social movements in America. The fact of the matter is that many ideologies have deep roots in this country. You can find libertarian streams that go back to the founding of the Republic. You can also find socialist streams that go back to the founding of the Republic. Tom Paine's last great pamphlet was called Agrarian Justice, and in it he outlined a theory of a social welfare state. In the years that followed, radical activists were often referred to by even the New York Times as Red Painites, i.e. that they were advocating for ideas outlined in Agrarian Justice, a rather social democratic notion. The Republican Party was clearly founded by many people who identified as social democrats, including some friends of Karl Marx who had immigrated after the 1848 uprisings in Europe. And this just goes on throughout our history. The truth of the matter is America has a very rich, radical, socialist, social democratic history. And when we begin to look at it, what we find is that it didn't always define this country, but it often added ideas to the discourse. And I think that's part of our crisis today. Our discourse has become very, very narrow, very defined by wealthy and powerful folks, and we don't have the inputs that we used to have, demanding Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, demanding civil rights, demanding big changes. Now, that's not to say we don't have movements today that are making demands, and some of them are rising, and we have a new era where we're seeing things happen. But we ought to understand that it was not uncommon in the era of, say, a Franklin Roosevelt to have President Roosevelt sit down and meet with Norman Thomas, who was the socialist candidate for President of the United States, very comfortably, to have John Kennedy read socialist Michael Harrington's book, The Other America, and to have Lyndon Johnson invite Harrington, as well as radicals like A. Philip Randolph, to the White House to outline ideas for how to address poverty.
What about Lincoln?
Well, Lincoln was a fascinating case. Abraham Lincoln was a great reader of Horace Greeley's New York Herald Tribune, and other publications that Greeley put out over the years. And the important thing to understand is that Karl Marx was Greeley's European correspondent. And so there's very little question that Abraham Lincoln read really radical ideas, and read a lot of really radical ideas. And what's interesting is that in a book I did on all this, it's interesting that when you listen to Lincoln's speeches, you will find that while I wouldn't even necessarily say he was a social democrat, except on some land issues, I think he may have been there, but what I will say is that he often integrated language that was clearly radical ideas, class analysis, talking about the importance of labor as it relates to capital. And you think, well, wow, that's certainly sounding like a foreign idea. No, that was something that Abraham Lincoln talked about in his first State of the Union address.
Who was Myra London?
Myra London was an immigrant from Lithuania who came to New York, and his father had been an activist. He grew up on the Lower East Side. He became very active in needle trades, the unions that made clothing. In the early years of the 20th century, that was a big deal. Myra London represented many of the rising unions. He was an activist. And in 1914, 100 years ago, Myra London filed his paperwork to run for the United States Congress as a socialist. He ran against a Democrat and a Republican from the Lower East Side, and he was elected. Now, what's fascinating about this was when he was elected, it wasn't that big a deal, because in New York City, there was a large social democratic, socialist movement there, and it wasn't that shocking to people. He went up to Congress and served in Congress as a very bold, very radical player, as did another socialist elected from Milwaukee 2 years earlier, Victor Berger. And I think this is one of the things that people ought to understand, that historically we have had socialists sit in our Congress. We've had social democrats sit in our Congress. We've had some very, very radical people there, and they have not hectored from the sidelines. They have often framed out ideas, and important ideas. And Meyer London, as we note the 100th anniversary of his election to Congress, was someone who was a great leader on a host of economic issues, healthcare issues, social justice issues, trade union issues, framing out much of what would become the New Deal, but also on issues like anti-Semitism and civil rights. And this is an important part of our history. When we deny third parties, and I will say third parties of the right and the left, and groupings that are outside of our mainstream politics, when we deny that history, we don't understand how things happen. Things happen when people on the Lower East Side of New York elect a guy like Meyer London to Congress.
That was The Nation magazine's John Nichols, interviewed last year. You'll find a link to his book, The S Word, at our website. Not so long ago, Yale University received a $150 million gift. That looked like a lot until Harvard scooped up $400 million a few weeks later. Both gifts came from Wall Street speculators, Blackstone Group founder and CEO Stephen Schwarzman, and hedge fund executive John S. Paulson. Paulson's donation alone was more money than 98% of U.S. colleges have in their entire endowments. It shows just how bad inequality's become, said critics. It also reveals a thing or two about what's become of our democracy. As economist Richard Wolff has pointed out, with their charitable contributions, Paulson and Schwarzman gave. In one case to endow an engineering school, in the other to build an arts center, Yale's third. But the multi-billionaires also took from the state. That's because under U.S. law, they can use their gifts to their alma maters to pay less to Uncle Sam in tax. Wolff calculates Schwarzman will save upwards of $75 million and Paulson way more. Public coffers, stretched already, will be that much worse off. Yale was already the nation's second richest college, Harvard the first. The two have scholarship funds and claim to consider all qualified applicants, but let's face it, if as a society we really wanted to diminish inequality and reduce the problems associated with unequal access to education and opportunity, would we really be giving more millions to a few private schools while the mass of public ones cry out for books? Freedom of choice for those who can choose, say the boosters. That's what makes capitalist economies distinct from the communist or socialist sort. We let the self, not the state, decide our fate. That's what makes capitalism great. We, as opposed to they, believe in maximum freedom for those who have money and minimum government. If such is really to be the way things are, let's at least tweak the terminology. As selfish as a word is taken, let's call capitalism what it is, anti-socialism. It's flat out anti-social. I'm proud of it. To tell me what you think, write to me, Laura, L-A-U-R-A, @grittv.org, and thanks. Today on the Laura Flanders Show, we hear from some movement elders. Dr. Cornel West with your former mentee, Michael Eric Dyson.
Oh, we got to pray for that Negro, yeah.
And later in the show, an excerpt from a new film about Miss Major Griffin Gracie.
The hardest person I think that we all have to fight straight across the board as a transgender person is ourselves.
How do we shape our future? Today on the Laura Flanders Show, we speak to author and architect Keller Esterling.
There's a ballooning number of extra-state organizations and extra-state actors.
And we speak with scientist Helen Caldicott about facing the nuclear threat.
Children getting cancer at the age of 6 instead of 60, that's a legacy we're leaving to our descendants. How dare we?